Hey everyone, welcome back. The research you've been doing on the book of Genesis, well, let's just say, get ready for a real mind bender.
Oh, is that what we're calling it now?
Yeah, because we're talking about using statistics to get inside the book of Genesis.
Using statistics to understand ancient texts. I like it.
Right. And you sent over this fascinating work by Dr. Steve Boyd. Okay, so he's a Hebraist.
Which, for anyone who's not a Bible scholar, means he's an expert in the Hebrew language.
Exactly. So this Dr. Boyd, he teams up with, get this, a statistician from Amazon?
You're not kidding. It's not your typical research team.
Not at all. What are they even trying to do?
Well, they wanted to see if they could figure out something that people have been debating for ages.
Yeah.
Was the creation account in Genesis, Genesis 1.1, 2.3, was it written as history or poetry or what?
Okay, so how can you figure that out using statistics? I mean, we can't exactly interview the author.
You're telling me, well, Dr. Boyd and his team, they figured if we can analyze the actual language itself, like the verbs.
Because verbs are action words, so they might tell us how the story unfolds.
Exactly, and they were thinking if they looked at how verbs were used in known examples of Hebrew poetry compared to, like, historical narratives, they might find a statistical fingerprint.
A fingerprint. That's interesting. You mean like a pattern in how the verbs are used?
Yeah, think of it like this. They weren't just looking up the words in a Hebrew dictionary, they were digging into the grammar.
So looking for a hidden code in the grammar, kind of?
You got it. But how do you even begin to measure something like that?
Exactly.
Well, they started with something called a null hypothesis.
Okay. For those of us who didn't take a statistics class.
Right, it sounds fancy,
Yeah.
but it's really pretty basic. Imagine you're about to do a science experiment. Before you even start, you basically say, okay, I think this is going to happen, but just to be sure, let's assume I'm wrong.
So you're trying to disprove your own idea.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because that's how you find out if your idea can stand up to the test. It's like saying, prove me wrong.
Interesting. So what was Dr. Boyd trying to prove wrong in this case?
He was saying, let's just assume for a second that there's no difference in how you use verbs in Hebrew poetry versus Hebrew narrative.
Okay, so he's setting up the challenge, right? Can we use these verbs to actually figure out what kind of writing this is?
You got it. Now, to keep things manageable, they didn't look at every single Hebrew verb.
Because there are a lot of verbs.
Tell me about it. They focused on 4 specific types of Hebrew verbs.
And these verbs are?
Okay, so one is called the wayik. That was basically like the past tense in English. Then you've got the quadal and the kutal. Those ones are a little tougher, but they kind of emphasize that an action is completed.
Oh, I see. So instead of just saying he walked, you'd say he finished walking or something.
Yes, exactly. And then the last one, the utal, that one's a real piece of work. Sometimes it acts like our present tense, but other times, boom, future tense.
A regular verb chameleon, huh?
You could say that. So they took these 4 verb types and they went looking for clues.
Did it work? Did they find anything statistically interesting, or was it just a jumbled mess of verbs?
You are not going to believe this, but get this. The numbers. They told a story. They found that Dr. Boyd's null hypothesis, remember, the whole let's assume I'm wrong, thing, it was wrong.
Wow. So there really are statistically significant differences in how those verbs are used.
They really are.
That's wild. So by analyzing how those verbs are used, you can get a clue about whether the author meant it as poetry or like a historical account.
It seems that way.
I mean, who would have thought? That's incredible. So what happened next? They took those findings and they applied it to Genesis.
That's right. They plugged Genesis 1.1-2.3 right into their statistical model.
What did it say about Genesis?
Get this, the analysis. It really looked like the creation account was written as a narrative.
So like a straightforward story.
It seems that way.
Wow. Okay. So then we get to the word day in Genesis, or yom in Hebrew. That was something you were really interested in, right?
Totally. Because if we're saying Genesis is a narrative, then we want to know. A narrative about what? Like, was it talking about a literal 24-hour day or something else?
Right. And even though that wasn't in the research you shared, you've heard Dr. Boyd say that he thinks yom means a literal day.
I have, yeah. And that's where things get interesting, because it kind of bumps up against other interpretations, like that part in 2 Peter 3.8, where it talks about a day being like 1,000 years to the Lord.
Which, if I'm remembering right, you used to think meant that God experiences time differently than we do.
Exactly, like God is outside of time. But honestly, after really spending time with that passage, I've come to see it as more about God being patient than, time literally bending around God.
Huh. It's fascinating how our understanding of these things can evolve. And that evolution, I mean, it can come from anywhere, right? Scripture, our own experiences, science.
Without a doubt. And
Ye-
honestly, that's what you were talking about with scientific skepticism, right? How we decide what to trust when it comes to evidence.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's easy to think that science and faith always disagree. But sometimes it's really about how we're understanding the evidence, whether it's spiritual evidence or scientific data, like you were saying about that lava from Mount St.
Oh,
Helens.
yeah.
Scientists tried to date it, but the results didn't match up with when they knew the volcano erupted.
It happens.
Right. So it goes to show even our scientific methods, they aren't perfect. What we think we know about the past, it can totally change as we learn more.
All the time.
It makes you think about that whole debate about dinosaurs.
Oh, here we go.
Because we haven't actually seen a dinosaur with our own eyes. We have fossils and things like that. But to really accept that they existed, we have to trust the scientists who study them,
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point.
And it's kind of like that with the Bible, too, right? I mean, we're trying to understand these ancient texts written in languages that most people don't speak anymore. We're piecing together history from so long ago.
Totally. And just like with those scientists dating that lava, we have to work with the evidence we have to interpret it, and sometimes, yeah, we have to make judgments based on what seems most likely.
Which makes it all the more interesting to me that you find yourself trusting the Bible more than, certain scientific or philosophical claims. It's not about rejecting those things outright, but just about, I don't know, finding what fits best with your experience of the world.
Right. Exactly.
Hmm.
And for me, that really resonates with this idea of faith-seeking understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying we have to check our brains at the door,
Yeah.
but we can approach these big questions with the belief that there's this spiritual reality underneath everything.
You mentioned that for you, that was really driven home when you were canoeing and you felt God's presence.
Yeah.
That direct experience, that was something else, huh?
It's one thing to read about God or hear other people talk about their faith, but to actually sense that presence,
Mm-hmm.
to feel connected to something so much bigger than yourself, it's hard to even describe.
It really makes you think about how this all started with statistics, and now we're talking about these profound experiences of faith.
Right. And it's like, they're not so different.
Mm.
Because just like Dr. Boyd, he used this statistical analysis to get a new perspective on Genesis. We could use all sorts of things, our reason, our experiences, our faith, to understand the spiritual world just like we try to understand science,
So if statistical analysis, I mean, if that can give us these incredible insights into the Bible, it makes you wonder what other unexpected tools are out there, right? Like, what could we learn if we used, I don't know, cognitive science? Or what about musical analysis to understand these texts?
Oh, wow. Now you're speaking my language. Can you imagine? To think about the psychology behind these stories or the rhythms and patterns in the language. Who knows what we might find?
Exactly. I feel like we're just starting to understand all the different ways we can learn and grow and honestly be surprised by these ancient texts.
That's what I love about it. Never a dull moment.
You got that right. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thank you for having me. I loved it.
And to you, dear listener, thank you so much for sending us this thought-provoking research. We hope this has inspired you to look for new ways to connect with your faith and never stop asking those big questions. See you next time.